So I was talking to an old colleague the other day, someone genuinely brilliant, really sharp mind. And I asked him, why didn't you go for that big management role? I mean, I knew he'd have been perfect for it. He just kind of shrugged, and said, oh, well, I'm just not a public speaking guy. Never have been. Said it like it was a fact of nature, like saying, brown eyes. It wasn't even a complaint, just a fact. And bam, just like that in his mind, that one fact just slammed the door shut on this whole part of his future. But the thing that really stuck with me was, well, I'd actually seen him present before. Okay, it was years ago, sure. But he wasn't bad, not at all. He was just, nervous like anyone else would be. Yet somehow his brain took that feeling, right? That little bit of momentary discomfort. And over time, it just sort of hardened it, turned it into this simple, permanent story about himself. And that story, I guess, in the end, it was just easier to accept than all the messy, uncertain work of, trying to get better at it. It made me realize his brain wasn't trying to sabotage him. Not really. It was just trying to save energy, be efficient. And that's when I started thinking, okay, how many of these neat little stories, these convenient facts, are running my life without me even noticing? Welcome to this deep dive. That story about my colleague, I think it perfectly sets up our topic today. We're talking about those mental shortcuts, the heuristics that we all rely on just to function day to day, and how these shortcuts, designed to help, can actually become these self-limiting traps, affecting our personal lives, our careers, even how we engage as citizens. It's like these ingrained habits of thought are the silent architects building the reality we live in.
It really is a paradox of efficiency, isn't it? That's what we have to grapple with. The human brain, it's this incredible prediction machine. But thinking, predicting, analyzing, it's expensive, energetically speaking. Imagine if every single tiny decision, like which sock you put on first or whether to take a new job, needed a full, conscious, blow-by-blow analysis. We'd be completely overwhelmed, cognitively exhausted before breakfast. So the mind, really out of necessity, creates these shortcuts, these heuristics, just to economize, to save that precious mental energy. And today, we're going to be digging into these tiny little stories, these mental defaults. Not really looking at them as flaws, not as character defects, but more as natural products of the brain's fundamental need to conserve energy.
Right. And our mission today, it feels pretty ambitious, actually. We want to go beyond just understanding how these limiting patterns get so rigid, so stuck. We want to provide, hopefully, a real framework for actually dismantling them, for taking them apart. So we're pulling together insights from, neuroscience, looking at the brain itself, from organizational strategy, how this plays out in companies, and from behavioral economics. The goal is to give you, the listener, a kind of toolkit for consciously designing better, more adaptive defaults, both for yourself personally and maybe for the institutions you're part of. We're basically going to try and learn how to debug the software that's running our lives.
Sound good.
Sounds like a great challenge. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's start right down at the most granular level, the brain itself, because that story my colleague told himself, I'm not a public speaker. It isn't just psychological, is it? It's fundamentally rooted in our biology and how our neural wiring actually gets structured. That's absolutely the essential starting point. The core principle here, really, is that the brain prioritizes familiarity, often over objective truth. If a thought pattern seems to work, meaning it reduces uncertainty or discomfort, even if it's suboptimal in the long run, the brain reinforces it, because doing so saves energy. So once a belief gets formed, maybe it's I'm socially awkward, or like your colleague, I'm just not a public speaker, the neural pathways linked to that belief get stronger every single time it's repeated. Think of it like driving the same route through a muddy field over and over. Eventually, it stops being a muddy track and becomes a paved road, a superhighway almost.
Wow. So that feeling of certainty we have about these beliefs, it's not actually evidence that the belief is true. It's just evidence that we've reinforced that particular pathway a lot.
Precisely. That's a crucial distinction. Researchers like W.R. Clem have detailed this process really well. It explains why these self-limiting beliefs feel so incredibly, undeniably real, like facts. It's because they've been reinforced so consistently, so often, that they stop feeling like mere ideas or thoughts. They actually become integrated into our sense of self, into our identity, and that makes them incredibly resistant to change. Even when there's objective evidence staring us in the face, like, the fact that your colleague wasn't actually terrible when he presented years ago, the belief persists. The brain has literally built this highly efficient, deeply entrenched pathway for that specific limiting thought. Changing it feels like trying to drive against traffic on that superhighway.
Okay, let's connect that directly to the mechanism of avoidance, because that seems key.
Yeah.
You mentioned the example of Eliza, the financial analyst. Let's talk about her. She has one shaky presentation early in her career, just one bad experience, and boom, her brain instantly creates this shortcut. Speaking equals danger. Humiliation. That becomes her fact.
Exactly. And this is where the brain's reward system kicks in, often in a really tragic way.
Yeah.
It reinforces the very pathway that's limiting her potential. See, every single time Eliza managed to avoid an opportunity to, maybe she ducked out of a meeting or passed the task to someone else, she got an immediate hit of relief. That instant physiological feeling of, phew, dodged that bullet, that's a dopamine reward. It feels good right then and there. And that dopamine hit acts as a powerful positive reinforcement. It strengthens the detrimental neural pathway linking speaking to danger, and it reinforces the identity associated with it. I'm someone who can't handle public speaking.
So she felt better right now by avoiding the discomfort. That immediate payoff was huge.
Huge, absolutely. But the actual cost, right? The stunted career growth, the missed leadership opportunities, the inability to share her ideas effectively. That cost is abstract. It's delayed. It's much less vivid in the brain's immediate reward system compared to that instant hit of relief. So that abstract future cost just can't compete, neurologically speaking, with the immediate pleasure of relief from anxiety. And so the negative shortcut, the avoidance, just perpetuates the problem. It feeds itself indefinitely.
Yeah.
Avoidance isn't just, procrastination. It's an active neurological feedback loop that strengthens the very fear it's trying to manage.
Okay, this rigidity is starting to make more sense from a brain perspective. To really understand why these beliefs get so locked in, you said we need to dive into the core neuroscience of habitual control. How does a choice actually shift from being this active, effortful decision to just an automatic response, something we do without thinking?
Yeah, it involves this really fascinating shift in which brain structures are running the show. Initially, let's say when Eliza was consciously wrestling with, should I sign up for this difficult presentation? What are the pros and cons? Her prefrontal cortex, or PFC, was heavily engaged. That's the part of the brain right behind your forehead. The PFC handles all the high-level stuff. Decision-making, planning, goal setting, weighing consequences. This is effortful control. It's the brain region you're using intensely when you first learn a complex new skill like playing the piano or learning to drive a stick shift car.
Right. It's like the CEO or the project manager overseeing this complex, resource-heavy task.
Exactly like that. And the brain, being efficient, it generally hates complex, resource-heavy projects running all the time. The goal is always to offload that work, to automate it. And the basal ganglia, these are structures deep inside the brain. They are central to forming habits. They handle that offloading process. Specifically, if we look inside the striatum, which is part of the basal ganglia, we can actually see the transition happening. When the behavior is new, when it requires conscious effort and attention, like Eliza thinking about presenting a part called the caudate nucleus is primarily engaged. The caudate is really focused on the outcomes and goals of your actions. But over time, as Eliza repeatedly avoided presentations and that avoidance action became more automatic, triggered by the mere thought of speaking, another part takes over. That part is the putamen.
Okay, caudate to putamen. What's the functional difference there? Why does that matter?
It matters hugely. The shift from the caudate being dominant to the putamen being dominant signals the transition. It's the switch from goal-directed, conscious effort to habitual automatic behavior. When the putamen is in control, the behavior tends to run more on environmental cues, almost like a script, rather than conscious deliberation about the goal. The PFC, that CEO part, essentially checks out. It says, okay, putamen, you've got this, freeing up those valuable mental resources for other things. Now, that automaticity is wonderfully efficient if the habit is positive, like automatically brushing your teeth. But if the habit is self-limiting, like Eliza's automatic avoidance, this shift makes the pattern incredibly difficult to interrupt consciously. The autopilot is fully engaged.
Okay, so the core problem then becomes, how do you force the high-level manager, the prefrontal cortex, back into the driver's seat, especially when the system has been running seemingly perfectly well on autopilot for so long? How do we force that conscious effort needed to, as you said, debug this ingrained programming?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And the answer lies in using structured, evidence-based methods, things derived from approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. These therapeutic approaches are fundamentally about doing exactly what you said, forcing the issue. They work by systematically supplying new, contradictory, objective reality to the brain. You're feeding it new data, and that new data forces those old, automatic, emotional pathways to be challenged and eventually, hopefully, rerouted or overwritten. We can actually organize this process into a pretty actionable 7-step method, a kind of roadmap for conscious transformation.
Okay, let's walk through that framework because this sounds like the practical toolkit people need if they're trying to overcome one of these lifelong limiting beliefs. I'm not good enough, I'll never succeed, etc.
Okay, step 1. Identify the root belief. And you have to be specific here. It's not enough to say, I have low self-esteem. You need to name the actual thought pattern, like, I'm not worthy of love, or I always fail when things get difficult. Then, using techniques like maybe journaling or guided reflection or sometimes therapy, you trace its origin. When did this story start? Was it something a parent said? A specific humiliation in childhood? A major failure later in life? Just naming it and understanding its roots allows you to start distinguishing the story from who you actually are. You externalize it.
Right. You're taking that limiting fact and turning it back into just a story. Okay, what happens next? How do we get to that deeper automatic wiring?
Step 2. Access the subconscious. We have to remember, these really deep, entrenched belief patterns aren't usually held in our everyday surface awareness. They're running in the background. So we need ways to temporarily slow down the brain's usual frantic electrical activity to reach them more easily. Techniques that promote deep relaxation and focused inward attention. Things like specific types of guided meditation, certain breathwork protocols, sometimes even things like binaural beats, can help the brain shift into what's called the theta brainwave state. Theta waves operate at a slower frequency, around 4 to 8 hertz. This state is often associated with deep relaxation, REM sleep, or very intense focused internal attention. And being in that state seems to allow temporary, easier access to those deeper, less conscious patterns and associated memories or emotions.
Okay. That sounds like some crucial excavation work needs to happen there.
It really is.
Yeah.
Which leads directly into step 3. Capture insights immediately. This is critical, as these memories or feelings or images surface maybe during or right after doing that step 2 work. Perhaps you suddenly remember a teacher's critical comment from 3rd grade, or feel a pang of that old inadequacy from a past relationship. You must journal them or record them instantly. Write them down, speak them into your phone, whatever works. Why? Because the conscious mind, the PFC, is incredibly quick to filter, rationalize, minimize, or just dismiss these surfacing feelings or memories. That wasn't a big deal. So capturing them raw before the conscious editor steps back in is vital. That's the raw material you need for the next step.
And step 4 is where the logic comes in, the real CBP part, challenge the thought.
Exactly. Now you take those captured insights, those core beliefs, and you apply rigorous, almost brutal logic to them. You have to ask, is this belief always 100% true in every single situation, without exception? Usually the answer is no. Then you actively search for and list empirical, concrete, contradictory evidence from your own life. If the belief is, say, I'm terrible with money, you force yourself to list every time you successfully saved up for something, paid a bill on time, made a smart purchase. You are logically dissecting the belief piece by piece, forcing your conscious mind, the PFC, to confront objective evidence that shows the automatic shortcut is flawed, it's inaccurate, and out of this process, you develop a specific reframe, a more accurate, balanced thought. So instead of the automatic thought, I lack the expertise to even apply for this promotion, the reframe thought might become something like, okay, looking back, I've successfully navigated steep learning curves before in other roles. I am capable of learning the specific requirements of this promotion as I go. It's grounded in past evidence.
That reframing process sounds like it feeds directly into step 5, which you called create grounded affirmations. I think this is where a lot of people stumble with affirmations, right? They try to affirm something that their brain just immediately rejects as untrue.
Absolutely. That's a common pitfall. The brain has a very strong filter for cognitive dissonance. It instantly flags and rejects generic or clearly untrue positive statements. Just repeating, I am a millionaire, when you're deep in debt doesn't rewire anything. It just creates internal conflict and makes you feel worse. Probably. A grounded affirmation, however, is different. It specifically references past successes or capabilities to provide stronger neural reinforcement for the new belief. So instead of a vague, future-oriented affirmation like, I will be a successful public speaker, you use one that's tied to a real felt experience, even a small one, like, I know what it feels like to confidently share my opinion in a small team meeting, or I remember successfully explaining that complex project to my manager last month. That kind of affirmation links the desired future state to a pre-existing positive neural memory trace. It gives the new pathway something solid to anchor to.
Okay. So you're not building the new belief from scratch in a vacuum. You're building a new wing, maybe, onto an already existing strong foundation, however small that foundation might be.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It makes the process much more believable and effective for the brain. And that grounding then sets up what is arguably the most critical step of all. Step 6. Prove the new belief through action. You have to generate new evidence. The fastest, most efficient, most powerful way to rewire the brain is through real-world experience, through small, targeted experiments. If your limiting belief is, I lack leadership skills, you don't immediately try to run a Fortune 500 company. That would be overwhelming and likely reinforce the old belief. Instead, you find a small, manageable experiment. Maybe volunteer to lead a tiny, low-stakes internal project, or organize a small social event for your team. The brain desperately needs new, positive data points to start building and strengthening that new neural pathway. Action provides that undeniable concrete proof. It overrides the old emotional pathway much faster than just thinking about it.
Makes sense. Thinking isn't enough. You have to do. And finally, we circle back to the principle of repetition, right?
Yes. Step 7, reinforce and repeat. This is non-negotiable. New neural pathways are like fragile seedlings initially. You have to consciously keep practicing the new thought pattern and, crucially, the new behaviors associated with it. You have to keep the prefrontal cortex actively engaged in choosing the new path long enough for the habit machinery, the putamen, to eventually take over and automate the new desirable pathway. We often hear the number 21 days to form a habit, but honestly, for deeply ingrained limiting beliefs and complex behaviors, it often takes much longer. Consistent repetition, day after day, is required to turn that initial intentional effort into the new energy-saving default, the default you actually want.
Okay, so we've really unpacked how the individual mind's relentless drive for efficiency creates these deeply personal, often quite painful, self-limiting shortcuts. But these patterns, these habits of thought, they don't just stay confined to one person's head, do they? When you scale this whole cognitive economy thing up to an organization with hundreds, maybe thousands of people, you get a much bigger, more complex challenge.
Absolutely. That scaled-up phenomenon is what we often call organizational inertia. And it is, quite simply, a calcified shortcut. It's a deeply ingrained habit, but operating at the collective corporate level. Resistance to change within a large organization, it's rarely just about people being malicious or stupid or deliberately obstructionist, though sometimes it feels that way. More fundamentally, it's the collective avoidance habit kicking in. It's the institutional brain, if you will, clinging desperately to the path of least resistance. And what's the path of least resistance? It's the way we've always done things. Because that way is known, it feels safer, it's cognitively and often financially less risky in the immediate short term.
Yeah, that really reminds me of that case study you mentioned about Mark, the manager at the big electronics retailer. His division apparently had run the exact same very successful back-to-school print catalog campaign for something like 15 years straight. That catalog wasn't just a marketing strategy for them. It had become their organizational heuristic for success. It was the safe, familiar, proven path.
Exactly. It was their shortcut. And when his own digital marketing team came forward with really robust data showing that the market had shifted dramatically and they needed to pivot hard. They recommended shifting something like 80% of that massive catalog budget over to targeted social media campaigns, digital ads, influencer marketing. Mark's division leadership flatly rejected it. Why? Because their internal thinking, their collective organizational mindset, was completely dictated by what we could call narrative foreclosure. They had taken a genuine past success, that profitable catalog, and frozen it in time. They turned it into a permanent, single, overarching organizational story. We are a print-first company. That's who we are. That's what works. And that powerful, entrenched story actively prevented them from even seeing or registering the new, contradictory data from their own team. The data didn't fit the narrative, so it was ignored or dismissed.
Wow. So that avoidance of the new, uncomfortable information, just like Eliza avoiding giving a presentation, it was essentially rewarded internally. Rewarded by the feeling of safety and certainty that came from sticking with what was known, what had worked before. But the delayed cost in their market, it must have been catastrophic when digital competitors ate their lunch.
Absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah.
The organization was completely trapped by its own success shortcut. It couldn't adapt. The failure there wasn't a lack of smart people or data or even technology. It was fundamentally a leadership failure. A failure to recognize and actively dismantle the company's own ingrained, automatic, limiting assumptions about itself. Adaptive decision-making was simply impossible because the established shortcut rejected the very premise of adaptation. Change felt like a threat to their identity.
What's really fascinating and kind of scary is how the same basic phenomenon, getting locked into ingrained mental models, plays out not just in, retail companies selling electronics, but in really complex institutional conflicts, especially in public policy debates where the mental models often come from entire disciplines.
Yes. We see these disciplinary blinders acting as powerful shortcuts, particularly in really complex, high-stakes areas like global climate change policy. You often have these intense debates between, say, two groups of highly intelligent, well-intentioned experts, maybe economists on one side and ecologists on the other. Both groups absolutely believe they're operating rationally, objectively, based on the best available science. Yet, they frequently arrive at completely diametrically opposed policy recommendations. Now, this isn't necessarily because one side is inherently right and the other wrong. It's often because their underlying organizational and disciplinary mental models, their trained ways of seeing the world, are functioning as fundamentally different shortcuts for interpreting uncertainty.
Okay, how do those models typically differ when they approach these big, complex, long-term problems like climate change?
Well, simplifying a bit, the economist's model often tends to view complex systems like climate and resource economies as relatively linear and gradual. Their thinking is heavily guided by historical economic data and experience, usually within the context of the existing macroeconomy. Their models often implicitly assume continuous, relatively predictable technological innovation and market adaptation mechanisms. And because they often rely on a somewhat restricted time series, focusing primarily on, say, the last century of industrial economic growth metrics, their analytical shortcut often leads them to counsel gradual, measured mitigation steps. The underlying assumption is often that we have decades to adapt, that the system is fundamentally stable. They tend to assume continuity because their models favor equilibrium states.
Which, as you say, could be a really dangerous shortcut if you're dealing with systems that might not operate linearly at all, systems with tipping points.
Precisely. That's where the ecologist's model often comes from a different place. Ecologists, trained in systems thinking, tend to view climate and resource systems as fundamentally nonlinear. Their models are often dominated by concepts like salient thresholds, critical tipping points, feedback loops, sudden booms, and catastrophic crashes. Their analyses often draw on historical examples or analogous systems exhibiting these dynamics. Think about mass desertification events, sudden fishery collapses, or historical population crashes. So their shortcut, based on this nonlinear systems thinking, frequently counsels much more urgent, potentially unprecedented immediate action. The core fear is that crossing a critical, perhaps irreversible nonlinear threshold could lead to catastrophic damage that gradual adaptation can't handle.
So it's not just that they disagree on the solutions, it's that their ingrained disciplinary norms, their embedded habits of analysis, their very expectations of how the world works, their professional shortcuts fundamentally shape how they interpret ambiguous scientific evidence in the first place. They're almost arguing about the fundamental nature of the system itself.
That's a great way to put it. And that deep conflict really demonstrates how complexity creates fertile ground for these behavioral decision-making biases to flourish, even at the highest institutional levels. We also see another powerful behavioral tendency playing a massive role in organizations and policy: angering. Decision-makers, whether they're sitting alone pondering a choice or gathered in a boardroom, tend to latch onto initial estimates or figures often based on incomplete or even outdated information. That first number becomes the anchor.
Right. And that initial number just sticks psychologically, even if much better, newer data comes along later proving it wrong.
Yes, exactly. There's this profound, often seemingly irrational resistance to incorporating new, better information if it deviates significantly from the initial anchor. This leads organizations and policymakers to fail to update their decisions, even when it would be perfectly rational to do so, especially midstream in a project or policy implementation. Think about a huge multi-year, multi-billion-dollar corporate research and development project. Let's say the initial projections were very optimistic. Even if interim data starts coming in showing the project is technically struggling or the market has shifted, the sheer amount of effort, money, and reputation already invested becomes the anchor. That's the sunk cost fallacy in action, fueled by anchoring. The organization, the leaders, they dislike the psychological pain and political difficulty of admitting the original estimate was wrong and pulling the plug. So often they continue throwing good money after bad, anchored to that initial decision.
That deep reluctance to admit a potential error, to change course, it really does sound like the organizational equivalent of Eliza avoiding the presentation, avoiding the discomfort of confronting reality.
It's a very similar mechanism scaled up. And related to this, we also see what's called bright line behavior. This is the tendency for people and organizations to judge performance relative to very specific, often arbitrary thresholds or bright lines. And hitting that bright line often becomes more important than overall efficiency or wisdom.
In corporate settings, managers might manipulate quarterly earnings reports, sometimes legally, sometimes less so, just to meet or slightly beat a specific target, like, say, last year's earnings number, or just showing a positive net profit, even by a penny. Hitting the bright line is paramount. In environmental policy, this might look like setting a pollution standard at exactly 1 part per billion, or aiming for a goal of 0 observable environmental impact. Now, those sound like laudable, clear, bright lines. They're easy to communicate and monitor, but they're often set somewhat arbitrarily and can be disconnected from a more rational analysis of costs and benefits. This can force incredibly expensive compliance efforts that yield rapidly diminishing returns, all just to hit that psychologically appealing but perhaps inefficient bright line number.
I think the most vivid example I ever heard of this kind of cognitive shortcut overriding pure economic sense was that famous study of New York City taxi drivers.
Oh yeah, that's the perfect classic illustration of bright line behavior trumping rationality. These cab drivers, as the study showed, tend to set a specific daily earnings target for themselves, a mental bright line. Let's say, just for example, they want to earn $300 that day. Okay, now on a busy, rainy Monday when fares are easy to find, they might hit that $300 target relatively quickly, maybe by mid-afternoon. What do? They quit early and go home. They hit their bright line. But on a slow, sunny Tuesday when fares are scarce, they might have to drive for many, many more hours, maybe late into the night, just to struggle across that same $300 threshold. Now, rationally, purely from an economic standpoint, they would actually earn more money overall and likely work fewer total hours per week if they did the opposite. Drive really long shifts on the busy days when earnings per hour are high and quit early on the slow days when earnings per hour are low. But they don't. They prioritize crossing that internal self-imposed daily earnings threshold. That bright line becomes the primary decision maker, overriding the actual economic data of the situation.
Okay, so we've thoroughly established how insidious and powerful these mental shortcuts can be, trapping us individually, paralyzing entire corporations with inertia. But the third major area we wanted to explore is kind of turning the tables, right? If we know that human rationality is predictably systematically bounded, limited by impulsiveness, context, cognitive shortcuts, how can we actually use that knowledge? How do we design environments or choices that make the optimal or desired behavior the easiest, most natural default choice? This, I gather, is the central idea behind the whole field of behavioral economics, or BE.
That's exactly right. BE starts from the recognition that humans are, as you said, cognitive misers. We consistently seek the easiest path, the path of least resistance. We satisfice rather than optimize. And this is a really critical departure from traditional neoclassical economics, which for decades largely assumed this mythical creature, the perfectly rational actor, Homo economicus, who always made optimal choices based on full information and stable preferences. BE says, no, humans aren't like that.
Yeah.
And this fundamental shift in perspective, acknowledging our predictable irrationalities, is precisely what allows policymakers, organizational leaders, even app designers to implement effective nudges.
Right, the nudge. That term has become quite famous. Let's define it clearly, though. What is the fundamental mechanism of a nudge? How does it work?
So Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, who popularized the term, defined a nudge as basically any low-cost, light-touch change in the choice architecture. Choice architecture just means the environment in which people make decisions. Could be the physical layout of a cafeteria, the design of a website form, the way options are presented. A nudge alters that architecture in a way that predictably influences people's behavior towards a desired outcome. But, and this is key, it does so without forbidding any options and without significantly changing economic incentives, like prices or fines. It's not a mandate. It's not a shove. It's just making the desired path the simplest, most appealing, easiest path to take, leveraging our natural inertia and shortcuts.
I absolutely love that Copenhagen train station example you mentioned earlier. It feels like the perfect blend of understanding psychology and implementing practical policy.
It really is a textbook case. It perfectly illustrates leveraging that common fastest, easiest snack shortcut we all fall prey to when rushed. Public health officials in Copenhagen knew that just telling busy commuters, hey, you should eat healthier snacks, wasn't working. People were busy, stressed, defaulting to habit. So they observed how people actually behaved. Commuters were operating primarily on speed and convenience when grabbing something at the station. They partnered with the convenience stores in the central train station. Now, they didn't ban the junk food, the chips, the candy, the soda. That would be a mandate, not a nudge. Instead, they dramatically changed the store layout, the choice architecture. They worked with the stores to move the healthy options, fresh fruit, bottled water, maybe some protein bars, to the absolute prime grab-and-go locations. Right by the cash registers, at eye level on the shelves, easy to reach. Meanwhile, the less healthy options, the sodas and chips, were moved to the back of the store or maybe down on the lower shelves, requiring more effort to find and grab.
So the rush commuter, running for their train, operating basically on autopilot, they just naturally defaulted to the healthy choice because it now required the least friction, the least effort.
Precisely. They successfully harnessed the existing cognitive shortcut, that powerful need for speed and convenience, and they redesigned the physical environment so that the path of least resistance naturally led towards a societal good. Better public health. This created a new, healthier societal default behavior purely through clever design, without imposing any restrictions on individual choice. If you really wanted the chips, you could still go find them. Most people just didn't bother.
This principle of minimizing friction, making the desired thing the default, that's how we harness the incredibly powerful status quo bias, isn't it? That deep-seated human tendency to just stick with whatever the default option is, largely due to inertia or perceived effort of changing.
Yes, and understanding and leveraging status quo bias has absolutely profound policy implications across many domains. Take organ donation, for example. In many countries, historically, becoming an organ donor required you to actively opt in. You had to find a form, check a box on your driver's license, actively sign up. And donation rates under opt-in systems are notoriously, often tragically, low. Not necessarily because people are against donation, but because of that small friction, that inertia barrier of having to take an action. Now compare that to countries or states that switch the policy to an opt-out system. Under opt-out, you are considered a donor by default, unless you take active steps to remove yourself from the registry. In experiments and real-world implementations, switching from opt-in to opt-out has often seen donation rates nearly double, sometimes soaring from around 40% participation up to over 80% or even 90%.
Wow. Just the simple physical act of having to check a box or uncheck one, that tiny bit of friction, was enough to deter almost half the potential donors when it was opt-in. But when the default was set to donation and the action required was opting out, inertia suddenly started working for the policy goal.
Exactly the same mechanism. We see it applied in financial planning, too. For instance, the Affordable Care Act in the U.S. included provisions requiring many large employers to automatically enroll their workers into health insurance plans. Again, switching from an opt-in requirement to an opt-out default. Participation rates increased significantly. Even very subtle changes, like fast food chains changing the default side dish offered with children's meals from French fries to, say, sliced apples or yogurt, leverages this powerful human tendency towards the path of least resistance. Parents have to actively ask for the fries.
Beyond inertia, we can also strategically leverage known human emotional tendencies, like loss aversion. Can you remind us what that is?
Loss aversion is the well-documented psychological principle that people feel the pain of a loss much more acutely, roughly twice as strongly, studies suggest, than they feel the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Losing $100 feels much worse than finding $100 feels good.
Okay, and how can that be used constructively in policy or behavior change?
Well, loss aversion is the psychological engine powering many effective behavior change strategies, particularly things called commitment devices. These are tools or contracts that people voluntarily enter into, specifically designed to help individuals who struggle with what economists call time-inconsistent preferences. That's the common human struggle between what we intend to do for our long-term well-being, like save money, lose weight, quit smoking, and what we feel like doing in the heat of the moment, spending, eating cake, having a cigarette. So people use pre-commitment devices like setting up forfeitable monetary bonds, often called deposit contracts, for goals like weight loss or smoking cessation.
Right, so the idea is you put a chunk of your own money down up front. And if you fail to meet your agreed upon goal, like hitting a certain weight target or testing negative for nicotine, you lose that deposit. It might even go to a cause you dislike.
Exactly. And it's that triggered loss aversion, the potent fear of losing your own money, that acts as the powerful motivator. That fear of loss is often neurologically much stronger, much bigger deterrent than the abstract positive reward of maybe getting a matching bonus if you succeed or just the long-term health benefits. It effectively weaponizes the psychological pain of potential loss against the pull of immediate gratification that tends to sabotage those long-term goals.
And this differential response to gains versus losses also shows up dramatically in framing effects, right? Where simply how you present the exact same outcome as a potential gain or a potential loss can completely flip people's choices.
Yes, framing is hugely important, especially in public health messaging and risk communication. The research is pretty clear on this. Messages that are framed in terms of potential gains, emphasizing things like survival chances, future benefits, positive outcomes, tend to be more effective for encouraging prevention behaviors. Things like wearing a seatbelt, using sunscreen, exercising regularly. You frame what the person stands to gain by taking the preventive action. Conversely, messages that are framed in terms of potential losses, emphasizing the risks of non-detection, potential damage, negative consequences of inaction, tend to be more effective for encouraging detection behaviors. Things like getting a mammogram, having a colonoscopy, going for regular dental checkups.
Okay, so for detection, you're telling people what they might stand to lose their health, early treatment options, by not taking the diagnostic action. That loss framing motivates the checkup.
Precisely. And we see this loss aversion playing out in environmental contexts, too, often through the lens of willingness to pay, WTP, versus willingness to accept, WTA, compensation. When policymakers or researchers survey people about potential environmental changes, they consistently find that people's stated willingness to accept compensation for allowing environmental quality to degrade, WTA, is often significantly higher, sometimes 2 to 5 times higher, than their willingness to pay, WTP, for an equivalent improvement in environmental quality. Why the big gap for the same change? It's largely triggered by framing. When you ask about WTA, you frame the current level of environmental quality as an endowment that the person currently possesses. The thought of losing that endowment triggers strong loss aversion, driving up the compensation demanded. Asking about WTP frames it as buying something new, which doesn't trigger loss aversion nearly as strongly.
That makes sense. Now, another huge challenge, especially for complex long-term issues like environmental policy, is that these problems are often quite abstract, statistical, and future-oriented. And that seems to run headlong into another powerful heuristic, the availability heuristic.
Yes, the availability heuristic is fundamental to how we judge risk and frequency. It simply means that we tend to judge how frequent, probable, or important something is based on how easily examples or instances of it come to mind. If we can easily recall vivid examples, we assume it's common or significant. The consequence is that abstract, slow-moving, statistically defined problems, things like ozone depletion was, or climate change still largely is for many people, are cognitively difficult to grasp. They don't generate easy, vivid mental images. This naturally leads to policy inertia and public underinvestment in addressing them. Unless or until a highly visible, easily recalled visceral event occurs that suddenly makes the abstract problem immediately available to our minds.
Right. The underlying scientific data about climate change might exist for decades, piling up in reports. But the public consciousness, and often political will, only really mobilizes when people can see it, feel it, recall it visually.
Precisely. Think about climate change again. It gained significant policy traction and public concern in the U.S., for example, during the unusually hot summer of 1988. That summer was plagued by record heat waves across the country, and the very high visibility Yellowstone National Park wildfires burning on the nightly news. Suddenly, the abstract scientific warnings about global warming became links to a tangible, uncomfortable, easily recalled experience and image. It became available. Similarly, the problem of stratospheric ozone depletion, which is chemically complex, only really achieved widespread public alarm and spurred international action after the discovery of the visible Antarctic ozone hole in the mid-1980s. The image of that hole was concrete, alarming, and easily understood, overriding the previous abstract descriptions of declining Dobson units.
And this understanding of the availability heuristic then leads to a deliberate policy or advocacy tactic, doesn't it? Where groups trying to intentionally manufacture a salient, available image to grab attention.
Yes, absolutely. Policy communication, especially from advocacy groups, often deliberately tries to create availability where it might not naturally exist. For instance, an environmental group wanting to raise concern about long-term sea level rise might commission a compelling, realistic video simulation. This video might show the potential effect of, say, a 2-meter sea level rise inundating a highly recognizable, emotionally resonant location, maybe flooding the historic monuments in Washington, D.C., or covering the beaches of Martha's Vineyard. And then, crucially, they might strategically release that visceral visualization, say, the day before a major hurricane is predicted to strike the East Coast. What are they doing? They're deliberately linking the abstract long-term problem, sea level rise, to an immediate, emotionally charged, highly available, and visceral threat, the incoming hurricane, maximizing its psychological impact and potential influence on public opinion and policy demands.
Okay, finally, let's look at a really interesting, perhaps more systemic proposal. One that aims to leverage financial behavior itself to try and counter some of these advocacy-driven biases that plague complex policy assessments. This seems to move beyond simple individual nudges and into redesigning the institutions that provide policy advice.
Yes, this is the proposal for establishing futures markets for environmental problems. It's a more radical idea, perhaps. The core concept is to create formal, regulated financial markets specifically, derivatives or betting markets, focused on assessing the likelihood of specific, measurable, long-term environmental outcomes. For example, you could have a market trading contracts based on the likelihood of average global temperatures exceeding a certain threshold by 2050, or the probability of a 5-meter sea level rise impacting a specific coastal region within the next 50 years.
Okay, but how would a financial betting market, which sounds a bit like gambling, actually function as a superior forecasting tool for policy compared to, say, relying on panels of scientific experts or government agency reports?
The potential advantage lies entirely in the incentive structure. Think about the biases inherent in the current system. Traditional advocacy groups on all sides often have strong incentives to shape their predictions. Environmental groups might be incentivized to exaggerate risks to galvanize public support and funding. Industry groups might be incentivized to downplay risks to minimize the perceived need for costly regulation. Even government science bodies can face political pressures. A well-designed futures market, however, aims to strip away much of this advocacy bias. How? Because when experts, organizations, even the general public are forced to literally put their money where their mouth is by betting real money on the future outcome, they are suddenly, powerfully, monetarily incentivized to provide their most accurate, unvarnished, objective estimate of the probability. Bad bets lose money. Accurate foresight is rewarded.
Ah, I see. So if a major energy company is publicly arguing very vociferously that global temperatures definitely won't rise more than 1 degree C, but the established futures market is consistently predicting a 3 degree C rise with high probability, that company would face some very awkward questions, maybe from its own shareholders, asking why it wasn't engaging in massive arbitrage in that market to profit heavily from the market's alleged mistake if they were so certain the market was wrong.
Exactly. That's the discipline the market imposes. Financial markets, for all their flaws, are often uniquely efficient mechanisms for aggregating vast amounts of decentralized information and eliciting relatively truthful forecasts, precisely because they directly penalize bad predictions and reward accurate foresight. Proponents argue that such a market mechanism could significantly reduce the rewards for extreme, politically motivated advocacy on environmental issues. It could provide policymakers with a continuous, dynamic, and potentially less biased barometer of collective expert judgment about expected future consequences. This could help them assess true risk more accurately, rather than having to rely solely on potentially polarized predictions from competing interest groups.
Okay, so pulling this all together, what we've really explored today is just how pervasive these mental shortcuts are. And while they're absolutely necessary for efficiency, they carry this incredibly high, often hidden long-term cost. Whether it's an individual like my colleague inadvertently closing doors on his own professional trajectory, or entire corporations getting paralyzed by organizational inertia, unable to adapt, or complex global policy debates getting bogged down by competing ingrained disciplinary biases.
That really is the common thread, isn't it? Across all these levels, personal, organizational, societal, the brain, individual or collective, is consistently tempted by and often content with the good enough path, the path of least cognitive resistance. But, and this is the hopeful part, by truly understanding the underlying mechanisms in neural architecture, how that shift in the striatum locks in automatic behavior, by seeing clearly how corporate inertia is often just a large-scale avoidance habit, fueled by narrative foreclosure and anchoring, and by recognizing how public policy itself, through things like nudges and defaults, is literally designing the path of least resistance for us, sometimes for good, sometimes maybe not. Gaining that critical insight allows us to intervene. It empowers us to stop passively accepting these default shortcuts as immutable permanent facts about ourselves or our institutions.
Yeah. It feels like the greatest act of leadership, really, whether you're trying to lead a corporation through change or navigate a complex policy challenge or maybe just lead yourself toward a better future, is fundamentally recognizing that the mind's inherent love of the simple answer, the easy path, the established shortcut, it isn't destiny. The complexity, the uncertainty, the messiness, that's actually where the opportunity lies. The real challenge, then, isn't trying to avoid that messiness of change. It's about consciously choosing to invest the mental energy now, investing it in those small, targeted, deliberate experiments, challenging the old belief, taking the small action, reinforcing the new path, until eventually the path you actually want to be on becomes the new, automatic, energy-saving default that you can rely on without even thinking.